Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Tuesday, November 15th, 2022. First story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. tells Ukraine that talks don't need to happen after Milley's comments. So, according to a report from Politico, the Biden administration has been reassuring Ukraine that peace talks with Russia don't need to happen anytime soon. After Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said that this winter will provide an opportunity for diplomacy. So it seems like they're doing some damage control here after Milley said last week that Russia and Ukraine might recognize that victory might not be achievable through military means and that therefore they may need to turn to other means like diplomacy. And he expects that the fighting will slow down this winter and that the moment for peace talks should be seized. So, citing unnamed US and Ukrainian officials, the Politico report said that US officials have conveyed to Ukraine that Washington was not trying to undercut Kiev's stated war goals of driving Russia out of all the territory it has captured. The US also said that just because there may be a pause in fighting this winter, that does not mean that peace talks need to happen. So while Milley is calling for peace talks, as I went over yesterday, other high level U.S. officials are against the idea, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The Politico report said that Sullivan's National Security Council is most resistant to the idea of talks, although there are a few aides on the NSC that are pushing for diplomacy. So the report said that this is interesting. This is the first place I've seen what the Pentagon is saying, what the Defense Department has been saying about these talks. But this Political report said that there is a broad sense within the Pentagon that the winter will provide a chance for a political settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and that senior U.S. military officials don't believe Ukraine can achieve its war aims, which include expelling Russia from Crimea. But so far, according to this report, these views have not had an impact on President Biden or his most senior staff. It hasn't had an impact on their decisions, their decision making. So they're not, pushing for diplomacy. They're not leaning on Ukraine for diplomacy. And if you're watching on video, I just included a map of the battle lines from South Front, just to show you if you see that Russia completed its withdrawal around the city of Kherson, and this is the Dnieper River here. So the talk of diplomacy, it comes after Russia withdrew from that city, pulling all of its forces off the west bank of the Dnieper River. So Pentagon officials said that the situation in the Kherson region is an example of the tough fight ahead for Ukraine, as it will be difficult to launch an offensive across the river in that region. And they quoted one U.S. official who said, quote, "Why not start talking about peace talks before you throw another 100,000 lives into the abyss?" End quote. So I thought that was interesting to see that a U.S. official said that. Now, while there are many elements of the Biden administration resistant to the idea of pushing for talks between Ukraine and Russia, there has been an increase in dialogue between Washington and Moscow in recent weeks. And on Monday, I'm going to go over this in the next story, but on Monday, William Burns, the director of the CIA, he met with his Russian counterpart in Turkey. But the White House stressed that that meeting was focused on warnings over nuclear weapons and not a negotiation over Ukraine. So that could be part of this kind of damage control they're trying to do after what Milley said. Signaling to Ukraine that even though they're talking with Russia, they're not trying to negotiate any deals or anything. But you really just have to think about if they do decide to push Ukraine to negotiate now. You just think it's been over 9 months now since this fighting's been going on. So many people dying, and just the fact that they obstructed peace talks earlier in the war, the U.S. and NATO. This could have been settled before the February 24th invasion, but also could have been settled, it seems like, at the end of March and early April when Ukraine and Russia were holding peace talks. But now Ukraine stands to lose more, and a lot more people are dead. But I guess they're making more money, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all them. All right, the next one here, the CIA director Burns, he meets with Russia's spy chief in Ankara. So Burns met with the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, that's the SVR is the abbreviation for that, in Ankara, Turkey on Monday, and this marks the highest level face-to-face meeting between a US and Russian official since the February 24th invasion. So the unannounced meeting, it was first revealed by media reports on Monday and then later confirmed by the Kremlin. And the Kremlin said that the talks between Burns and SVR chief Sergei Narishkin were requested by the U.S. So it was the U.S. initiative, and the White House officials later confirmed that that was true. So the White House said again that the meetings were not an attempt to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. They said it was focused on reducing the risk of nuclear escalation and the detention of U.S. citizens inside Russia. A White House spokesperson told Reuters, quote, "He is not conducting negotiations of any kind. He is not discussing settlement of the war in Ukraine. He is conveying a message on the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons by Russia and the risks of escalation to strategic stability. He will also raise the cases of unjustly detained U.S. citizens," end quote. So the spokesperson repeated the Biden administration's position that nothing will be negotiated about Ukraine without Ukraine. It's been their mantra. But again, I just mentioned in this article, while they're still saying that, we know Jake Sullivan recently held high-level talks with Russian officials over the phone, nothing in person, and that the U.S. and Russia are prepared to resume New START talks. That's the last nuclear arms control treaty between the two powers. And then we have what Milley's been saying. But Burns is an interesting character because he's the CIA chief. His last known high-level meeting with Russian officials was in November 2021. He was sent to Moscow to warn that the U.S. was watching Russian troop movements in the region. But earlier in his career, Burns served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he had warned in 2008 that NATO expansion in the region would likely lead to war. And this is thanks to WikiLeaks, a cable that they released that Burns wrote in 2008, and it was titled "Niet means Niet," which no means no in Russian. And basically predicting that Ukraine and also Georgia's NATO aspirations would spark a war, specifically more so Ukraine. I'll just read one little excerpt from this cable because it's just so important. He said, quote, "Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face," end quote. So, I mean, what happened in Ukraine? It wasn't so much exactly NATO membership that sparked the civil war, but it was a U.S.-backed coup ousting of Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine in 2014. That was more favorable lean more toward Russia, and it was his ousting and backing and the backing of the Western powers and that coup that led to the civil war in the Donbass. And then Russia, this invasion really is a continuation of that war. So it's them intervening in the civil war. Of course, it went way beyond the Donbass. I'm not justifying anything that Russia has done. But in their mind, that's what happened here. So, thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that it's not just, a conspiracy theory that NATO expansion played a major role in provoking this war. And also since 2014, the NATO really, after the coup, NATO really started supporting Ukraine. They sent trainers there. The U.S. sent CIA to the front lines of the Donbass war to train Ukrainians. That was revealed by Yahoo News earlier this year, and all sorts of things like that also played a part in provoking this war. All right, the next one here. The U.S. announces more sanctions on Russia or Russia-related sanctions. The Treasury Department said that the sanctions targeted 14 individuals and 28 entities that are accused of helping Moscow procure weapons or helping provide financial assistance to Moscow for them to get more weapons. So unlike previous sanctions, we've seen these measures targeted many people and entities that are not based in Russia. The Treasury Department announced sanctions on real estate firms in France, companies based in Switzerland, and a Taiwanese microelectronic company. The Treasury Department also announced sanctions on family members of Suleiman Kurimov, who is a Russian billionaire and politician. He's currently a member of the Federation Council, which is Russia's upper house of parliament. And the Treasury Department says he was first sanctioned by the U.S. way back in 2018. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, she said in a statement that the U.S. and its allies would continue to, use sanctions and export controls and things like that to try to hurt Russia. And um, just repeated something I went over yesterday. Yellen said that she expects some sanctions will remain on Russia even if a peace deal is reached to end the fighting in Ukraine. And that's a signal that the U.S. wants to keep Russia isolated from the U.S.-led global financial system for the long term. And I think that they do. Um, and that could really inhibit peace talks as well, because that's a possible incentive for Russia is the lifting of sanctions. It looks like another incentive for them would to be to turn on the Nord Stream pipelines again, but that doesn't seem to be possible anymore. Although they did say one line of the Nord Stream 2 wasn't damaged, so who knows? But anyway, the next one here. So Biden held talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and she told Biden that the current state of U.S.-China relations is not in anyone's interest. So they held these talks on Monday in person in Bali, Indonesia, ahead of the G20 summit. According to the Chinese Foreign Ministry's readout of the meeting, Xi's message to Biden was that the current state of U.S.-China relations is in nobody's interest. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said, quote, President Xi pointed out the current state of China-U.S. relations is not in the fundamental interest of the two countries and peoples and is not what the international community expects, end quote. So the readout said that Xi stressed the two powers should work together to put relations back on track, and that China does not seek to supplant the U.S. as the world's leading power. And then according to the White House, President Biden told Xi that the U.S. will continue to compete vigorously, which is how the White House put it, with China, signaling that the U.S. really doesn't want to change course. U.S. officials said before the meeting that the talks will be more about managing tensions rather than resolving issues. And Biden said that he said this in a press conference afterwards. The White House also said he told Xi this in this meeting that lasted 3.5 hours, that the competition should, quote, not veer into conflict, and underscored that the U.S. and China must manage the competition responsibly and maintain open lines of communication, end quote. So really, it seemed like Biden's message was not so much to get relations back on track. It's more about, managing the tensions, as officials said it would be about. Discussing Taiwan, though, Xi did warn Biden that the issue was a red line for Beijing. The Chinese leader, quote, stressed that the Taiwan question is at the very core of China's core interests, the bedrock of the political foundation of China-U.S. relations, and the first red line that must not be crossed, end quote. So that was, the Chinese Foreign Ministry's readout. And that's just a warning, that a red line that the U.S. doesn't seem to be taking seriously. This article I just mentioned how this meeting comes with the U.S. taking all these steps to increase support for Taiwan. And despite all these steps, which I'm going to go over more in the next story, Biden claimed in this meeting with Xi that the U.S. was still committed to the one China policy. They didn't say that explicitly in the White House readout, but they said that Biden laid out in detail how the U.S. has not changed its one China policy. So they actually did. Sorry, they actually did mention the one China policy explicitly, but it's just my friend Pat McFarland, who writes for the Libertarian Institute, wrote an article about how the U.S. is kind of gaslighting China on this issue. They take all these steps that are against the status quo or going towards that direction, and then they act like they're not doing anything. So. While there's also the tensions show no sign of waning between the U.S. and China, both sides did agree to maintain high level communications. So they're talking, at least. After the meeting, the White House said that Antony Blinken is going to make his first trip to China soon. First trip to China as the Secretary of State. I mean, he's not, really the best diplomat as he has demonstrated us. I remember, I think it was last year, him and Sullivan met with China's top two diplomats in Alaska for talks. And it was just a disaster because Blinken opened them by just accusing them. I mean, it was on film too, just accusing them of, violating the so-called rules-based order, just, uh, you know, listed all this stuff, just accused China of all sorts of things. And then the Chinese officials just hit back at them. And it just made Blinken and Sullivan look really weak. Uh, and I had a feeling while watching the talks, it was like the Chinese officials had two things to say. One, if Blinken opened the talks aggressively, and one if he didn't. And they really hit back at him pretty good. Um, but anyway, Biden and Xi, they discussed other global issues, including the war in Ukraine and the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And Xi told Biden that China supports the idea of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine and hopes that the U.S. and its Western allies will also conduct dialogue with Moscow. All right, the next one here. So this is more about Taiwan. I think this is a pretty big story. So the Washington Post reported on Sunday that Congress drafted a plan with input from the White House to authorize $1 billion in military aid for Taiwan annually under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to ship weapons directly from Pentagon stockpiles. So the U.S. has employed this authority to arm Ukraine. And the bulk of the over $19 billion in weapons that the U.S. has pledged to Kiev since Russia's invasion have mostly come from the U.S. military stockpiles. And this authority, this drawdown authority, it allows the U.S. to get weapons into the hands of Ukraine much more quickly. They take them and they could just ship them right there, because other forms of military aid require purchasing weapons, and it takes much longer. So this report from the Washington Post said that the $1 billion has been attached to the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, but that's still being finalized. And the Senate has also attached to its version $10 billion for Taiwan in another form of military aid known as foreign military financing, but that will be dispersed over the next 5 years. So that will be $2 billion a year. So the foreign military financing, that's a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to purchase U.S. weapons. And that process takes much longer than the drawdown because it requires a contract period, and it often takes years to actually deliver the weapons. So together with the drawdown authority and the FMF, Taiwan would receive $3 billion in U.S. military aid each year. So it would go from receiving, because the U.S. sells weapons to Taiwan. It has since it severed relations in 1979 as part of opening up with China. But it doesn't give them military aid like this. So this would bring U.S. military aid from zero to $3 billion. I mean, that's huge. And while Ukraine right now is the biggest recipient of military aid by far, Israel is the largest recipient of annual military aid that is budgeted out each year. It's $3.8 billion. So this would make Taiwan second to Israel in that respect. So the Post report, it said that Congress could have difficulty getting the money for Taiwan approved by the appropriations committees, as it will require budget cuts elsewhere. Congressional aides told the Post that if the aid does not make it through appropriations, the White House could ask Congress to authorize the Taiwan aid as emergency funds, which it has done that's what they've been doing for Ukraine. So really the story here is that they're looking to arm Taiwan like they are Ukraine, shipping them tons of weapons as fast as they can. And this massive push, it comes as tensions between the U.S. and China are very high over Taiwan. And while there's no sign that China is planning an invasion in the near future, despite all the U.S. claims, there's no signs really that China is going to try to invade. I mean, it would take a lot to invade that island, but it has stepped up its military pressure on the island in response to what it views as U.S. provocations, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island in August, which provoked China's largest ever military drills. So you see what they do, they provoke something and then they have to respond to it. And lawmakers in Congress, they say that they need to give Taiwan billions in weapons in the name of deterrence, even though it's clear from China's actions and rhetoric that increased U.S. support for Taipei will make conflict more likely. The report quoted Rep. Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin. He said, quote, "One of the lessons of Ukraine is that you need to arm your partners before the shooting starts, and that gives you your best chance of avoiding war in the first place," end quote. So there's that notion that you see that the U.S. didn't do enough in Ukraine, and that's why Russia invaded, when in reality, it's U.S. meddling and intervention in Ukraine that provoked this war. And now they're going down a similar path with Taiwan. And it was funny because so the 10 billion in aid, that the foreign military financing that they're trying to give to Ukraine, that came from the Taiwan, I believe. Oh man, I can't think of the name of it. I think it's the Taiwan Policy Act that was full of all other things that would have fundamentally changed U.S. support for Taiwan. But like the diplomatic aspects of that bill are not being included in the NDAA. But anyway, when the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed that bill, Mitt Romney said, we're doing something highly provocative here. That's how he put it. And he approved it anyway. He voted yes on it anyway. So it's not like, again, this is obvious how China is going to view all this. And it's just clear what direction this is going to send everything. In the Post report, it said that the new military aid for Taiwan could give the island anti-ship cruise missiles, anti-air defense systems, self-detonating drones, naval mines, command and control systems, and secure radios. So all sorts of stuff. They also mentioned Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that they've been sending Ukraine. Those are the portable shoulder-fired ones that they infamously gave to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. All right. So the next one here, Turkey accuses the U.S. of complicity in the Istanbul bombing. So Turkey's interior minister on Monday rejected condolences from the U.S. on a deadly bombing that took place in Istanbul and suggested that Washington was complicit in the attack due to its support for Kurdish militant groups in northeast Syria. So the bombing in Istanbul is pretty major. It killed 6 people and wounded 81 others. And Turkey has accused a Syrian affiliate of the Kurdish group PKK of being behind the blast. Turkish authorities arrested a female suspect who said was sent from Syria to carry out the attack. For their part, the PKK denies responsibility and said that they wouldn't target civilians. So the PKK is active in Turkey, and it's considered a terrorist organization by Turkey and also by the U.S. But across the border in Syria, the U.S. backs Kurdish militants with ties to the PKK. So I'm going to throw a lot of abbreviations at you here. So the PYD is considered the PKK's Syrian affiliate. And they're also associated with the YPG, which is a militia that is the primary component of the SDF, which is the group that the U.S. openly backs. That stands for Syrian Democratic Forces, and that's a Kurdish group. And the YPG is the military side of it. And they say, and the YPG is also, it seems like, Turkey's right when they say that the U.S. backs PKK affiliates in northeast Syria. And they haven't been happy about this for a long time. They've been pretty upset with the U.S. over what they're doing in northeast Syria. And I have to mention, Turkey does often launch military operations against Kurds in northeast Syria. They launched some pretty recently. They're very active in Syria, and they back some pretty bad groups there as well. And the White House and the U.S. Embassy. So on Sunday, the White House and the U.S. Embassy in Turkey extended condolences for the Istanbul bombing. But because of the U.S.'s support for the Kurdish groups in Syria, Turkey's Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu, he rejected the U.S.'s comments. he said, quote, "I emphasize once again that we do not accept and reject the condolences of the U.S. Embassy," end quote. He said that the U.S. condolences were as if, quote, "the killer is among the first ones returning to the scene," end quote. And then he went on to add, and this is according to Anadolu agency, it's Turkey's state news agency. He said, quote, "Whoever is feeding the PYD there, trying to provide internal intelligence to the PKK, is the perpetrator," end quote. So, he's insinuating that the U.S. bears responsibility for this attack. This is a major issue. Turkey is a NATO ally, but there's a lot of complications between its relationship with the U.S. And this is a big one. Is the U.S. support for the Kurdish groups in northeast Syria? At the same time, you had William Burns was in Ankara on Monday, so it's not like they took any drastic measures and canceled that meeting, because Turkey has been a broker in this conflict. They hosted talks back in March between Russia and Ukraine, and they're really continue to call for peace talks. But that's it for the news for today. We have linked to a lot of good viewpoints, as always, from Daniel Larison, Ted Galen Carpenter, Connor Eccles over at Responsible Statecraft. And our picture story, actually, I wanted to mention because the FBI is opening an investigation into the killing of Palestinian American Shireen Abu Akleh, and she is the Al Jazeera journalist who was killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank in Jenin back in May. She was shot in the face. And there's been all these investigations by, media outlets and such that have concluded, she was deliberately killed by Israeli forces. And now the FBI is apparently launching an investigation into it, which I'm surprised by. I thought the Biden administration was kind of just going to try to, make people forget about this. But of course, Israel is not happy, and Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, called the decision a grave mistake and said that Israel will refuse to cooperate. So all that military aid, it doesn't give you much respect, because she was an American gunned down by Israeli forces, and Israel just does not want to cooperate at all when it comes to it. They deny that it was intentional, that the killing was intentional, even though she was wearing a big vest that said press. I think they tried to say there was a gunfight in the area, a gun battle, but that's not true. According to eyewitnesses and other investigations, she was just standing there, press, and shot in the face by Israeli forces. Okay, so that's it again for the news. I'll catch you guys tomorrow. You can support the show, antiwar.com/donate. If you want a nice antiwar.com t-shirt like the one I'm wearing, you can purchase one in the link in the description. And you can like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, all that good stuff. Share it with your friends. Listen to the audio version wherever you listen to podcasts. But that's it. I'll catch you tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.